if you're trafficking illegal substances, you can't deduct your business expenses, which, I mean, that seems rational, but we live in a space where that applies to Schedule 1 and Schedule 2. So if you make it Schedule 3, you just eke it in and say, all right, well, you're not trafficking illegal stuff anymore. We still don't like it, but it's not illegal, so you can deduct your business expenses.
Shall we reschedule? The latest news out of the US is that cannabis could be downgraded from a harmful Schedule 1 substance to a medically beneficial Schedule 3 one. But what does this actually mean? Does it bring America closer to federal legalization? Will it make the cannabis industry an easier place to do business? Chris Day from the GCNC gives us his take on what it all means. Hello, and welcome to the Lobsterpot podcast. I'm Dave Barton, and I'm kind of having my American Beauty moment, with the rose petals, when the girl's just like, well, that's me right now in cannabis. What do you make to that? Do you think I'd be a good substitute for, was it Mena Suvari in a kind of cannabis remake of American Beauty, Jamie?
I'm going to do that great thing. That person who's never seen any films?
Yes,
it's me.
It's you.
Surprise. I'll say yes, Dave. In my experience working with you only ever surprise me, so I will say yes.
Good. And on the topic, this is my segue, right, of American Beauty. There we have the lovely Mr. Chris Day from the GCNC, the Global Cannabis Network Collective. Great friend of the show. Good to have you, Chris. How you doing today?
I'm good. Thanks for the flattery, man.
Anytime.
It's always appreciated.
Anytime. But we're here not just for your beauty, but for your brains as well today. So we need to pick your brains on all this stuff that's happening in the US regarding rescheduling. Now, we know that things are happening in the US. It feels like it's slightly monumental, and that sounds really odd for something to be slightly monumental. But why don't you give us a lowdown, what you know, and what's your perception on things that are happening? Are we closer to legalization federally in America through these latest announcements?
So in typical U.S. governmental fashion, right, this actually happened in August, but because they don't like to talk about stuff, especially as it relates to cannabis, because it admits sort of how dysfunctional they are. It required a Freedom of Information Act request in order to get all the information. So only recently did the 232 pages associated with this come out. And that's why, first of all, that's why we're talking about it now and not back in August. We got an indication back then that this was happening. And so now we have a bunch of interdepartmental conversations happening between Health and Human Services and the DEA about rescheduling from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. This is still not the US government going, woohoo, we've got cannabis and we've finally seen the error of our ways, and so now we're going to make this easy for everybody. This is them saying, well, we just can't hide it anymore. It is obviously got medicinal benefit, although we don't really want to admit it, but we will. And so we'll schedule it as Schedule 3. And now the question is, what does that mean, as you posed, for those of us in this industry? And there is good news about that.
Awesome. So we like good news.
I'm happy about it because it does allow the U.S. industry in a lot of ways now to have a chance at profitability in a way that it didn't have before. The major thing that happens is 280E, which is the element of the law that says if you're trafficking illegal substances, you can't deduct your business expenses, which, I mean, that seems rational, but we live in a space where that applies to Schedule 1 and Schedule 2. So if you make it Schedule 3, you just eke it in and say, all right, well, you're not trafficking illegal stuff anymore. We still don't like it, but it's not illegal, so you can deduct your business expenses.
Okay.
That absolutely
That's huge. We know that's huge. We know that's huge for so many reasons. I mean, the idea of running a business where you can't deduct business expenses is, well,
impossible, right?
Absolutely.
Like,
yeah.
It is unsustainable, especially when you're competing against a black market that doesn't have that.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is enormous and would be wonderful. That hasn't happened yet with these documents. What it does is it says, Health and Human Services says, okay, we've done this analysis, and it seems highly likely, based on the fact that there's all of these doctors across the country that are now talking to patients in the medical market in the US about these different indications, that cannabis does actually seem to be helping. Even the federal government research shows that. And remember, this is, in order for this to be a recommendation in the US from the Department of Health and Human Services, it has to show that this is true in the United States, which means all of this research that we know exists out there in the world gets completely ignored. It's as if it doesn't exist. They aren't required to acknowledge it. They aren't required to admit any of it is there. So this has to be done in the US. So finally, in the US, they're saying there is some medical benefit. So we'll put it at Schedule 3. 280E goes away. And the other thing that should affect is banking, right?
Mm-hmm.
So because it drops away a bunch of the restrictions that banks have, saying, yeah, but it's still illegal. They're already banking pharmaceutical companies that have Schedule 3 drugs. They're banking, hospitals that are prescribing Schedule 3 drugs. So in theory, they should loosen up banking restrictions, at least on medicinal cannabis companies. Still a whole bunch of stuff that would have to be figured out between the state adult use programs and the federal government. Obviously, if they do this, the feds in their clear wisdom will need to have some sort of influence now over regulations. They'll want that. So there will be future messes to be had, but companies who can write off their business expenses will now be able to write off the costs of the lawyers to fight all that. So I think,
and marketers too, right?
Absolutely.
just putting it out there. But no, absolutely. But just to think again, this is huge news. What doesn't it mean? I mean, it doesn't mean that, okay, if you're recognizing it federally as something, medically beneficial, it doesn't mean that it's going to be, rescheduling doesn't mean it's going to be medically available across every single state federally.
Well, it does. No, it doesn't. They're still likely to remain in place. The state by state programs, especially at the adult use level. But it does say at the federal level, it's now a Schedule 3, not a Schedule 1.
Okay.
So that will apply to everywhere, including places like Texas that continue to just, kind of be problematic about the whole thing. So I think it does fundamentally change a lot. And the other thing that it does is it'll change the attitudes of investors and capital. I think it makes the liquidity of the market much better very quickly, because it's a whole different ball game for people to say, well, do I want to invest in something that I can wrap my head around, a pharmaceutical type product at a Schedule 3, versus I'm trying to invest in some sort of illegal industry. Obviously, we've rationalized around that now for a decade or more, but for those who are on the fringes and holding back, it absolutely changes the game, and that affects things globally. Because if U.S. capital and investment loosens up and U.S. banking loosens up, that's been a chokehold on the world since since the 1950s. So it is a very good thing overall. There are valid arguments from a number of sectors in the United States that are really concerned about how this could give an advantage to pharmaceutical companies, really pushes it in that direction, does have problems with access. And I think all of those are valid, and they need to be continually watched, because it's clear the politicians, as much as anybody, are going to want to follow the money. And that means they're going to consider rigging laws the way they always have in favor of entities that can drive money their way. So, this is going to be an ongoing battle, but this is progress. No matter how you slice it, there are hesitations and concerns, but it is progress, and it's progress that positively affects the situation for cannabis in the United States, throughout North America, and globally. In my opinion, but it's a pretty well-educated opinion.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So, happy to debate folks on it, but I'm pleased. I'm pleased that this seems to be moving forward.
I think it's a really interesting point you make about almost it's a de-risking factor is what this is for investment. And really what it stands to is the fact that it's not just the fact that something in a document back in the summer has been unearthed and therefore kind of deburied and has been discovered. It's the fact that it shortens the potential timeline for federal legalization. And then panning from that to the global side of things, you have the largest market with the most money available. There is a genuine trickle down. You could argue for or against the notion of trickle down economics, but in this case, that actually is how it works, because the most established, richest market is going to massively impact all of the other ones in terms of policy and in terms of investment. I think one thing in the US that's interesting, I don't know if you can speak to it at all, is because it's such a massive internal market, and because you have a really deep lattice work of governmental bodies, law enforcement of all sorts of different shapes and sizes, it feels like there's a lot more pulling factors than there are perhaps in European nations. I would look at the UK, for instance, and we would look at, it would primarily be the Home Office, for instance, that would really have a big say on what happened with cannabis. Whereas it sounds like in the US, there's a lot of different kind of people involved who are quite happy to push and pull as they need. Do you see that kind of opening up at all?
Okay, so one point we were chatting about before we came on, and I should reiterate it here for everybody, is this document between Health and Human Services and the DEA, right? So the DEA has made it very clear to everybody, and they want to continue to make it clear to everybody, that ultimately this is their choice. Like, they've held on to this as a key component of their daily lives for a long time. And so they're the ones that have to sign off on this rescheduling piece. I think it coming out the way it did puts additional pressure on them to do it, because it just makes this look even more farcical than it's been. So we will continue to have the DEA wanting their, the DEA is going to want their perspective to be held. Then you have a lot of other law enforcement groups that will also have their opinions, but they have to follow whatever their jurisdictional laws are. So if you are in Colorado, your approach is going to be much different than if you're in Texas. And in different states, the local politics and topics of the day are going to continue to affect this, along with the ongoing propaganda of what everybody thinks is happening versus what is real. So that's going to take a long time to sort out, for sure. There's a lot of border politics in states like Arizona, Texas, New Mexico. But the New Mexico market's doing pretty good and growing pretty well. And the law enforcement folks there, for the most part, haven't been raising a big stink, because they don't play the border politics the same way that Texas and Arizona does. So if we can cut through all of the propaganda, which is hard, and just get down to what is actually occurring, the more cards we can take off the table, making marijuana, playable, cannabis playable in these markets, all of a sudden, I think it'll get much more rational. We'll see.
It'd be interesting to see how it shakes out from, I guess, like, again, not to lean too heavily onto the kind of US politics thing, because again, it's even more complicated than UK politics, which in itself is just ridiculously complex. But again, like we were saying before we're recording, election year, could something like this be a feather in the cap for the current administration, or is it going to be a divisive? I mean, again, speculation, of course, but
Yeah. Well, everything in the U.S. is divisive at the moment, and has been for quite a while. We won't put a time limit on it because that in and of itself is divisive. But I do think I don't know if it's a feather in the cap of Biden. I mean, Biden's history with cannabis is not good if you go way back, but attention span in the US is only about 3 or 4 years. So in recent memory, he's been pretty agnostic about it. And I think if the DEA reschedules it, it's a very convenient move for everybody, right? Because you don't actually need Congress to do anything. And right now, congressional movement is impossible on almost everything. I mean, there was a debate about getting rid of daylight savings time, right? Which should be one of the easiest things in the world because it's so incredibly stupid and everybody basically agrees, and they couldn't even get that done. So like trying to do anything is crazy. So if you can do it through a rescheduling during your presidential administration, you will have succeeded at something that you said you would probably do. And I don't think they really want it to happen under a potential, I don't even want to say it, a second administration of a previous president. And it's just better to get it done now and see where it goes.
No, absolutely. I mean, it's a strange one, isn't it? But again, it feels like all of these, it's like a sort of kind of unraveling a sort of Rubik's cube, isn't it? A lot of this. I think Jamie used the word lattice, and I like that a lot. Just kind of so many different layers of kind of peeling back to sort of say, oh, hang on, is that, yeah, well, hang on, we can't do that, but we can. It's kind of like all of these different moving parts, just, something needs to kind of unlock. And it feels like this, it's almost like leveling up. It's not completing the game. Do you know what I mean?
Good. Bureaucratic pastry.
Bureaucratic, I can't even say it.
It's a tough one.
Bureaucratic pastry.
I love it. And sometimes bureaucracies actually can work in your favor. And I think in this case, in spite of all the nonsense, like if you want a dark comedy, read the 232 pages of this communique, because it really is pretty screwed up, but it works in our favor in this case, right? It's one of these where all of these ridiculous assumptions that they're making, this half information still moves us in the right direction. And that's what the world needs. And if we can accelerate that movement in the US, that actually justifies more research, that justifies more capital inflow, that decreases the tax burden on existing plant-touching businesses. Like if you wrote a memo of things the industry would like to see in the US, that's a whole lot of them, right? A whole bunch of them, just with the stroke of a pen of some people at the DEA of all places.
Right, yeah, the irony.
Thought the DEA could help us out. We've said this for a long time, that was an ideal solution to deschedule it completely, right? That's not going to happen, folks. Like descheduling completely is not going to happen. They won't do it. You read this document and you see the justification they have for not doing it, even though some of the research that they put in there is talking about comparing it to alcohol, and most of the time the results are less negative for marijuana than alcohol in their own documents here. And alcohol is not scheduled at all.
No.
But it doesn't matter. In the same paragraph, they're also comparing it against cocaine and heroin and benzos and all these other things. So you don't want to ask bureaucrats to think too hard. You just want to say, look, on this one, it's pretty easy, Schedule 3, okay, if that's the best you can do, do it so that we can get money flowing and preserve businesses that many of them are actually quite good if they aren't taxed at the rates they are. So anyway.
No, it's very true. So, I mean, so in terms of what needs to happen, so the DEA need to sign off on this document.
Yep.
What, I mean, again, do we have a kind of timeline, or is there a kind of best guess about when that or might happen, or are they kind of holding out, or is it a case of, well, what, I mean, you don't know what goes on in the corridors of power, but
yeah, I don't think they're quote unquote holding out. I mean, to us, it will feel that way. They're big ass bureaucracy, right? Like all of them. So, you know, if it takes 2-3 years, that's holding out. If it takes months, not so much. I mean, I'm not sure anything happens quicker than a year at the government level. So if the memo between Health and Human Services went over to the DEA on August 29th of 2023, a year would be this summer, right? Late summer. The challenge, of course, is we have an election at the end of the year. So I would say if I was betting, and I'm not, but if I was, I would say, okay, well, it's this summer sometime or not at all this year. Right. Because I don't think they're going to come out unless it's like an October surprise, you know, hold it back until October, put it out as good news before the election. I suppose it would happen if I was orchestrating things from a PR perspective. During a presidential election, I might do that.
Yes, like again, then it becomes the kind of strategic feather in the cap to sort of say, look what we did, you know.
Yeah, we need a few more votes to get us over the hill because none of this makes sense and the world is crazy.
Yeah, well, I think we can agree to that actually, just generally.
Yes.
No, I mean, there's so much that, I mean, again, looking around the world at different things that are happening, you know, spoke to someone about Germany, you know, keep seeing news about Czech Republic, Thailand backtracking. It feels like, you know, we're at the start of 24. It feels like, I don't know. I mean, it feels like it's going to be a big year, even if nothing sort of significant happens. The wheels are turning in the background. Do you know what I mean? That's what it feels like.
And you know, I've read all those stories as well and been following it. And I also think we have to keep in mind that the way in which headlines are phrased matters, right? So every time a headline comes out and says, country XYZ is backtracking, or the US is only considering rescheduling to Schedule 3, not descheduling. Most of these countries, if you really dig into it, aren't necessarily backtracking. They're starting to get more formulaic about the way they're considering moving forward. Right?
They're taking it seriously. They're taking it more seriously.
Yeah, it's shifting from like convenient political bullet points into policy. Obviously, you're not ever going to get everything you want. If you think that's true, like just go somewhere with lots of rainbows and live there, because that's not how the world works. And so if you want to get all the way to complete descheduling, I mean, me too, but that's not going to happen. You're going to be waiting for decades. And if you're just happy being sort of in this status quo, I guess that's fine. But most of us want to get to a point where businesses can be profitable. Most of these countries want to get to a point where they have structured legal frameworks that they can work within, and then they can mature those laws over time. But I get frustrated when I see all of these stories about how it's moving backwards, things aren't happening, blah, blah, blah. No, they are happening. Things are moving. They're not moving as far and as fast as we'd like them to, but let's keep perspective and continue to champion those places that are actually having these educated debates about actual legal frameworks, not procedural changes between two huge bureaucratic organizations that we're lucky there's positive outcome this time, which is how I see the U.S. move. I'm happy that we're lucky and there could be a positive outcome this time, but the fact that it's taken so long is just painful.
Yes. But that's it. But again, it's all progress at the end of the day. This is, like you say, it's important to remember. But no, some fascinating stuff there. So thank you. Thanks for filling us in, Chris. Really appreciate the insight. And we shall speak with you soon. So thank you very much, sir. And happy
reading, y'all. Look it up. 232 pages of bureaucratic joy. Moving forward.
Excellent. You heard it here. Enjoy. All right. See you soon. Take care.
Yeah.
Cheers. Bye.